Yeah.
I mean, you've written a lot about, I suppose, moving forward, that, you know, you've written a lot about around recovery and harm reduction and methadone and whatever. Where do you see, I suppose, where do you see harm reduction at the moment?
I'm giving a talk tomorrow, and the title of that talk is Harm Reduction at the Crossroads. And in a way, I do feel that harm reduction sits at an intersection which, where it goes, will actually have a very significant impact on the place that harm reduction comes to occupy. I mean, it has had in the UK and in many other countries, it's had a huge influence over the last 20-25 years. I mean, I don't think that there isn't another set of ideas that has been more influential than harm reduction within the drugs field. And yet I think that there is a sense in which, whether it retains that momentum and whether it can continue to have such a profound influence on the field is an open question. Because it seems to me that harm reduction had at least two lines of concurrent development, one of which was genuinely and innovatively focused on trying to reduce the harm associated with the drugs that people are using, and it connected into sort of public health issues, and I think was the mainspring of much of what became the kind of the social movement of harm reduction. But then I think there was another side which was to do with drug law reform, a perception that the greater harm to do with illegal drugs is the fact that they're illegal. And I think that though there was no necessity for those two things to sit alongside each other, and I think that they do now and have done for some time, to an extent, in some tension. And I think if, to the extent that harm reduction is about reducing the harm associated with people's drug use, including as a prelude to working with people to become drug free, then I think it has a continuing critically important role to play. To the extent that it gets taken up with drug law reform, I think it's in danger of losing its place in relation to reducing the harm associated with people's drug use. It becomes a kind of campaigning political organisation, and I think the appeal of that is nowhere as broad as the appeal of the movement seen in terms of reducing actual harm associated with people's drug use.
Okay.
And I think that it's not clear which of those sides will be the most influential in the kind of coming years, because within the UK, or at least in some parts of it, there's a major shift towards recovery, which potentially can disconnect fairly comprehensively from harm reduction. Not, I think, productively so, because it does seem to me that actually there is a kind of commonality in harm reduction that enables individuals to move from reducing the harm associated with their drug use to increasing stability, to addressing issues of why they're using drugs in the first place, and then moving into recovery. But I think if the focus becomes much more about, well, it's everybody's right to use drugs, drugs should be legalised, then I think that it will become a rather marginal movement, wholly irrespective of whether one argues for legalisation or not. I still think that's a somewhat of a marginal movement in terms of, well, what are you going to do in relation to helping people who are currently using illegal drugs?
Yeah, because I know, like, to just think about the like Transform, for instance, when they looked at that regulation blueprint, and it's been taken up. It's been looked at very closely in different countries, and obviously you've got the Portuguese model as well, which is kind of, I wouldn't say decriminalisation as such, but it's issuing the kind of the yellow card, which is to me is quite effective, because it's actually picking up is picking up drug users at a very early stage, and is giving that intervention at a much earlier stage than people are actually presenting as they do, traditionally at centres when they're in chaos.
I think that it's a fascinating time in a sense for people working in harm reduction, and I have been quite critical in some of the things I've written, but I think that we had reached a stage where people were not asking hard, searching questions about what is the nature of the services that are being offered to people. There was a kind of acceptance that, well, if it falls under the umbrella of harm reduction, then it's fine, and there was very little critical consideration about, well, what is the nature of the harm that's being reduced? Is that the whole story, or is that a prelude to other interventions? Whose harm is being reduced? I think that I started to ask some of those what were quite fundamental questions, and I think that wasn't particularly welcomed. And I know, I mean, I was looking at for my talk tomorrow. I was looking at a lecture that Jerry Stimson gave a year or so ago in London, and Jerry refers somewhat disparagingly to a Scottish sociologist who'd commented on methadone, and it was almost like he wouldn't even use my name because I was somehow the Antichrist because I'd raised questions about methadone. And yet the questions that I asked about methadone as to how beneficial is it, how long should people be on methadone, is there something beyond methadone? Is it a lifelong prescription, or is it a time-limited prescription? What does it mean if people are combining methadone with street drugs? Yeah. Is that something which would lead one to think that well, you should reduce their methadone, or should you increase their methadone? But it's a searching question to ask. Well, what are you doing by the prescription that you're providing? But it wasn't particularly welcome, and I certainly have made many offended many people. But in a way, I think that is the role of academics, to ask questions rather than to promulgate an ideology.